The desert sun hammered down on forward operating base Sentinel like divine judgment, turning metal scalding and sand into glass. Captain Malcolm Reeves stood outside the operations tent, aviator sunglasses reflecting the shimmering heat waves that rose from the tarmac, where a single A-10 Thunderbolt II sat alone, away from the other aircraft. Its titanium bathtub cockpit gleamed dull gray, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruding from its nose like the business end of God's own wrath. Reeves was laughing, shoulders shaking as he turned to the cluster of junior officers around him. They were all watching the same thing, a figure in a flight suit walking toward that A-10, helmet bag slung over one shoulder, moving with a stride that suggested neither hurry nor hesitation. The figure was smaller than the others on base, and that was all Reeves needed to see. He had already made up his mind before she even reached the ladder. The radio chatter from the previous night still echoed in the operations center. Call sign Revenant had been assigned to their forward air support rotation, transferred in from some cushioned assignment stateside according to the scuttlebutt. Reeves had been flying combat missions in Afghanistan for 3 years, had put steel on target in places that didn't exist on maps, had talked pilots through situations that would have broken lesser men. He knew the game. He knew what real war looked like. And he knew what happened when the Pentagon started checking diversity boxes instead of combat readiness. This pilot hadn't even introduced herself yet, hadn't shown her face in the operations briefing that morning, and already Reeves had heard the whispers. She'd flown training exercises, simulation hours, stateside defense patrol, nothing that mattered, nothing that counted. Now she was here in his operational theater, expected to provide close air support for missions where seconds meant the difference between soldiers going home or going home in boxes. The other officers were watching Reeves for his reaction, feeding off his energy. He took off his sunglasses, wiped them on his tan undershirt, and watched as the pilot reached the ladder of the A-10. She didn't pause, didn't look around, just climbed. Professional, mechanical, distant. That was somehow worse than if she'd been nervous. It meant she didn't understand what was waiting for her out there beyond the wire. Reeves replaced his sunglasses and turned back toward the tent. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of jet fuel. Somewhere in the mountains to the north, infantry units were pushing into hostile territory. They'd need air support soon. Close air support. Danger-close fire missions where the difference between surgical precision and friendly fire came down to split-second decisions and nerves that didn't break under pressure. Reeves wondered how long Revenant would last before she cracked. The briefing room felt like a pressure cooker, the air conditioning struggling against the combined body heat of 24 personnel crammed into a space meant for 15. Captain Reeves sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching as the forward air controller team leader, Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, ran through the tactical situation on the digital map projected against the canvas wall. Hale was old-school infantry, 38 years old with a face that looked 50, carved into hard angles by too many deployments and too many close calls. His voice was gravelly, authoritative, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command a room. The map showed the Korangal Valley, a serpentine scar of hostile terrain notorious for chewing up American units and spitting out casualties. Red markers indicated known enemy positions. Blue markers showed the advancing infantry patrol. The gap between them was shrinking. Hale tapped a ridge line with his pointer. Romeo Company is pushing up this draw at 0800. Intelligence suggests a reinforced Taliban position approximately here, with probable heavy weapons emplacements. Terrain is extreme vertical relief, civilian structures scattered throughout the target area. This is not a permissive environment. His eyes scanned the room and stopped on the back corner where a figure sat alone, flight suit unzipped to the waist, tan t-shirt underneath, brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Captain Kiera Vance, call sign Revenant. She was taking notes on a knee board focused entirely on the tactical display. She hadn't looked at anyone since entering the room, hadn't introduced herself, hadn't made small talk. Reeves noticed several of the other pilots exchanging glances, smirks barely concealed. The reputation had preceded her, stories circulating faster than official orders. She'd been flying for 6 years but had never deployed to combat theater, training command, weapons school instructor, stateside defense readiness. All the checkboxes for promotion without the dirt underneath the fingernails. Now she was here, expected to deliver ordnance in a valley where angles of attack were measured in degrees of impossibility, and every run risked flying into terrain or ground fire or both. Hale continued the briefing, his words painting a picture of complexity and danger. Our ground element will be calling for immediate air support once contact is initiated. Expected enemy strength is 30 to 40 fighters with prepared positions. Collateral damage considerations are extreme. Rules of engagement require visual confirmation before weapons release. This is a troops in contact scenario with friendly forces danger close. We need precision. We need discipline. We need pilots who can thread the needle. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Reeves watched Vance for any reaction. She just kept writing, her pen moving in quick, efficient strokes across the knee board. No tension in her shoulders. No nervous energy. Either she was completely confident or completely oblivious. Reeves bet on the latter. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, the kind of black that exists only in places far from civilization, where light pollution is a forgotten concept. Captain Vance walked the flight line alone, her red-lensed flashlight casting a blood-colored glow across the belly of the A-10. She moved methodically, checking every access panel, every control surface, running her hands along the leading edges of the wings where 30 rounds sat waiting in magazines that could spit 4,000 rounds per minute. The Thunderbolt II was ugly in the way that purely functional things are ugly, designed not for grace but for survival and lethality. Its engine sat high on the fuselage to protect them from ground fire. Its cockpit was surrounded by titanium armor thick enough to stop 23 shells. Its entire design philosophy was simple: get low, get dirty, destroy the enemy, and bring the pilot home alive. Vance had loved the aircraft from the moment she first saw one screaming low over the Nevada test ranges during her initial flight training. While other pilots fantasized about the sleek lines of F-16s or the raw power of F-15s, she'd been drawn to the brutal honesty of the Warthog. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was a gun with wings, and it made no apologies. She completed the external inspection and climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The seat was already adjusted to her smaller frame, the rudder pedals positioned exactly where she needed them. She began the startup sequence from memory, her hands moving across switches and controls with the unconscious precision of thousands of training hours. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. The multifunction displays flickered and initialized. The heads-up display projected onto the armored glass in front of her, feeding her altitude, airspeed, weapon status, and threat warnings in glowing green symbology. She strapped into the harness, the 5-point restraint system pulling tight across her shoulders and lap. The weight of the survival vest, the G-suit connections, the oxygen mask hanging by her right cheek, all of it was familiar, comfortable, right. Outside the cockpit, a crew chief appeared in her peripheral vision, holding up his flashlight to signal he was ready for engine start. She returned the signal and advanced the throttles. The twin turbofan engine spooled up with a rising howl, and the A-10 came alive beneath her like a waking predator. The radio crackled in her helmet. Revenant Tower, you're cleared for taxi to runway 27. Winds are calm. Weather is clear. Romeo Company reports they're in position and ready to commence movement in 30 mics. You'll be on station before contact is expected. Vance keyed the mic. Revenant copies. Taxi 27. Her voice was level, professional, empty of anything that could be mistaken for doubt. The Korangal Valley spread below like a topographical nightmare, all vertical ridges and sheer drops and villages clinging to slopes at angles that defied logic. Captain Vance flew the racetrack pattern at 12,000 feet, high enough to stay out of small arms range, low enough to respond quickly when the call came. The sky was immaculate blue, the morning sun painting the mountains in shades of amber and shadow. Through her canopy she could see the thin thread of the river cutting through the valley floor, and the tiny geometric shapes of compounds scattered across the terraces. Somewhere down there, Romeo Company was moving up a goat trail toward a Taliban position that had already killed 3 soldiers in 2 previous engagements. She monitored 3 radio frequencies simultaneously: the discrete ground frequency, where the forward air controller would call for fire, the air-to-air frequency shared with other aircraft in the area, and the operations net connecting her to the Tactical Operations Center back at Sentinel. Right now, all 3 were quiet except for routine check-ins. She ran through her weapons inventory again, even though she'd checked it 20 times already. 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, 2 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, 1,100 rounds of 30 high-explosive incendiary ammunition in the drum magazine feeding the GAU-8, full countermeasures suite, everything she needed to turn a mountainside into a graveyard. The radio broke squat. Revenant, Titan 2-6, say status. That was the ground element's call sign. She recognized Staff Sergeant Hale's voice, strained with the exertion of moving uphill in full combat load. She keyed the mic. Titan 2-6, Revenant. On station at Angels 12, playtime 6+30, full loadout, ready for tasking. Angels 12 meant 12,000 feet. Playtime 6+30 meant she had 6 hours and 30 minutes of fuel remaining. The response came back clipped, professional, but she could hear the sound of heavy breathing beneath the words. Revenant, good copy. Be advised we are approximately 1 click from suspected enemy position. Expecting contact within 10 mics. Stand by for talk-on. Talk-on meant he'd verbally guide her eyes onto the target once they made contact. Standard procedure for close air support, ensuring the pilot and ground controller were both looking at the same piece of terrain before ordnance was released. She clicked the mic twice in acknowledgement and continued the racetrack pattern. Below her, the valley remained peaceful, deceptively tranquil. The villagers would be awake now, starting fires, tending animals, going about their lives in the shadow of war. The explosion was visible before the radio call came through. A puff of brown dust erupting from the ridgeline followed immediately by the staccato popping of automatic weapons fire. Captain Vance's eyes locked onto the position even as her hand moved to tighten the orbit, bringing the A-10 around to give her a better angle. The radio exploded with controlled chaos. Contact! Contact! Titan 2-6 taking effective fire from ridgeline position. Grid November Delta 437825. Multiple fighting positions. Heavy weapons. Request immediate air support, danger close. Friendlies are 100 meters south of target area. Hale's voice was loud but controlled, the cadence of a man who'd done this before and knew that clarity saved lives. Vance was already descending, bleeding off altitude in a spiraling turn that kept her energy high and her options open. Titan 2-6, Revenant, descending to investigate. Say position marked. She needed absolute certainty before putting steel on target this close to friendly forces. The response was immediate. Revenant, Titan 2-6 is marking position with IR strobe. Cease fire marking now. Through her targeting pod display, Vance watched as an infrared strobe began flashing on the mountainside, invisible to the naked eye but blazingly obvious through her FLIR camera. The friendly position was a cluster of soldiers pressed against a stone wall, pinned down by fire coming from positions 50 meters uphill. She could see muzzle flashes from 3 distinct positions, and the thermal signatures of at least a dozen fighters moving between prepared fighting positions carved into the rock face. The geometry was terrible. The enemy held the high ground with overlapping fields of fire and prepared cover. The American patrol was trapped against an open slope with nowhere to go. If they tried to retreat, they'd be cut down in the open. If they stayed, they'd be ground down by superior numbers and position. They needed fire support, and they needed it now. Vance rolled the A-10 onto its side, pulling the nose down into a dive that angled her directly toward the target area. The airspeed indicator climbed. The altimeter unwound. The heads-up display painted the targeting pipper onto the mountainside, and she adjusted slightly with stick and rudder, making micro-corrections to account for wind and angle and the curvature of her diving arc. Titan 2-6, Revenant, in hot from the south. Confirm all friendly forces are south of marked position. She needed absolute confirmation before she pressed the trigger. The response came back strained. Revenant Titan, all friendly south of IR strobe. Clear to engage, clear hot. She was low now, 3,000 feet and dropping, the mountain rushing up to meet her. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was the reason the A-10 existed. 7 rotating barrels capable of firing depleted uranium penetrators at a rate that made the aircraft shudder and lose airspeed when fired. Captain Vance's thumb hovered over the trigger as the targeting pipper settled onto the first fighting position, stabilized despite the turbulent air boiling up the mountain face. At 1,500 feet she fired. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, a deep mechanical roar that drowned out both engines, a sound like the sky tearing apart. The aircraft slowed violently as mass left the gun, each round weighing nearly a pound, the recoil equivalent to one of the engines thrust in reverse. Through the heads-up display, she watched the tracers every fifth round glowing red arc down into the mountainside and disappear into a perfect line of destruction that stitched across the enemy position like a sewing machine from hell. The burst lasted exactly 2 seconds, 50 rounds. When she pulled off target and yanked back on the stick, climbing back into the safety of altitude, the entire ridgeline where the enemy position had been was obscured by a cloud of pulverized rock and dust. She rolled inverted to look back at her run and saw fire blooming where the position had been. The radio crackled immediately. Revenant Titan, good hits, good hits. 1 position destroyed, but we still have fire from at least 2 more positions to the northeast. They're trying to flank us. Staff Sergeant Hale's voice had the edge of a man whose situation was getting worse, not better. Vance was already turning, her eyes tracking along the ridgeline looking for the other positions. The mountain face was a maze of boulders and terraces and compounds, every shadow potentially concealing fighters. She couldn't just hose down the entire area. The row required positive identification and the kind of precision that could only be achieved with controlled, deliberate strikes. She saw them. 2 firing positions 50 meters apart, muzzle flashes visible even in daylight, small figures moving between them carrying the long shapes of PKM machine guns. They were trying to establish a crossfire that would cut the American position to pieces. She keyed the mic. Titan, Revenant. Tally 2 positions northeast of your location. I can take them both, but I need you to stay exactly where you are. This is going to be close. There was a pause, then Hale's voice came back. Revenant, we're not going anywhere. You're cleared hot. Do your thing. Do your thing. As if it were that simple. As if threading 30 rounds between friendly soldiers and enemy fighters on a mountainside wasn't the kind of calculation that required absolute faith in your own abilities. The second run came in from a different angle, perpendicular to the first, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible second. Captain Vance kept the A-10 low, following the contours of the valley floor before pulling up sharply to establish the attack angle she needed. The targeting pipper floated across her heads-up display as she adjusted for wind drift and the slight right roll of the aircraft. The first enemy position came into the pipper and she fired. Another 2-second burst that sounded like the end of the world and sent a line of destruction carving across the mountainside. She walked the round slightly right, adjusting for the second position as the aircraft shuddered and bucked, and then she was climbing again, braking hard left to avoid the ridge that suddenly appeared in front of her canopy. Too close. She'd been too low and too close, and for half a heartbeat she thought she'd misjudged the terrain. But the A-10 clawed its way up and over and she was clear, her heart hammering, her hands rock steady on the controls. The radio erupted with voices. Revenant Titan, you got them both. Both positions destroyed. Enemy fire has ceased. You're a goddamn artist. There was something in Hale's voice that hadn't been there before, a note of genuine respect that transcended the professional detachment of radio protocol. In the Tactical Operations Center back at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Captain Malcolm Reeves stood in front of the video feed from Vance's targeting pod, his arms no longer crossed. The footage showed the before and after, fighting positions intact, then fighting positions obliterated. The precision was surgical. The effectiveness was absolute. Major Carlson, the air operations officer, stood beside him watching the same feed. "Jesus Christ," Carlson said quietly. "Did you see how close that second run was? She cleared that ridge by maybe 20 feet. Reeves didn't respond immediately. He was watching the pattern of the gun runs, the way Vance had adjusted her angle of attack for each position based on the terrain and the proximity of friendly forces. It was textbook close air support, the kind taught at weapons school but rarely executed this perfectly in actual combat. The kind that required not just skill but genuine artistry, an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional geometry and timing that couldn't be trained, only discovered. On the radio, Hale's voice continued. "Revenant, Titan, what's your playtime remaining? We're going to continue push toward the objective, but we might need you again." Vance's response was calm, almost casual. "Titan, Revenant, playtime 4 plus 4 5. I'm not going anywhere." The next 2 hours passed in tense watchfulness as Romeo Company moved through the valley, clearing compounds and checking caves, always with the A-10 circling overhead like a guardian angel with a cannon. Captain Vance maintained her pattern, conserving fuel, monitoring the radio frequencies, watching the ground force move through the terrain with the slow deliberateness of men who knew that every corner could hide death. She'd refueled once from a KC-135 tanker that had appeared at the designated time and place, the boom operator passing her 11,000 pounds of JP-8, while she flew formation 18 inches behind the massive aircraft at 25,000 feet. The tanker crew had said nothing beyond the required technical calls, but she'd seen the boom operator give her a thumbs-up through his window station before they separated. Word was spreading. In the operations center at Sentinel, the morning shift had been replaced by the afternoon crew, but Captain Reeves remained, watching the video feed, listening to the radio traffic, unable to pull himself away. Major Carlson had left to get food and returned with an extra sandwich that he'd placed in front of Reeves without comment. They ate standing up, eyes on the screens. The tactical display showed Romeo Company's position advancing up the valley. The video feed from Revenant's targeting pod showed the same terrain from above, the infrared camera picking out thermal signatures of people and animals and engines cooling in the shade. Staff Sergeant Hale's voice came through the speakers. "Revenant, Titan 2-6. We have eyes on the primary objective, the compound we briefed this morning, showing multiple thermal signatures inside, at least 8 to 10 individuals. Requesting ISR support before we move in." ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. He wanted her eyes before he took his men into potential danger. Vance responded immediately. "Titan, Revenant, I'll make a low pass with the FLIR and see what I can give you. Stand by." The A-10 broke from its pattern and descended, dropping to 3,000 feet, then 2,000, then lower still. Through the targeting pod, Vance zoomed the camera onto the compound, a 2-story structure of mud, brick, and timber surrounded by a low wall. The infrared camera painted the scene in shades of white and gray and black, revealing the heat signatures of multiple individuals moving inside the structure. She counted them carefully, checking windows, doorways, the courtyard. "Titan, Revenant, I count 12 military-age males inside the compound. I see what appears to be weapons in the courtyard, long rifles. No positive ID on women or children at this time. Recommend you proceed with caution." The assault on the compound happened with the speed and violence that characterized infantry combat at close quarters. Romeo Company stacked up on the compound gate while Captain Vance orbited overhead, her targeting pod locked onto the structure, her weapons armed and ready in case the soldiers needed immediate fire support. She watched through the FLIR camera as the breaching charge blew the gate off its hinges, as the soldiers flooded through the opening, as muzzle flashes began to spark inside the compound. The radio traffic was clipped, professional, punctuated by the sound of gunfire. Contact inside, Multiple enemy engaging. Staff Sergeant Hale's voice cut through the chaos. Revenant Titan, we're taking fire from the second floor, eastern window. Can you put rounds through that window without bringing down the building? The request was extraordinary. He was asking her to put 30 rounds through a specific window of a building where American soldiers were fighting room to room on the ground floor. The margin for error was measured in feet. One mistake, one slight miscalculation, and she'd kill the people she was trying to protect. Captain Vance looked at the compound through her targeting pod, measuring angles, calculating trajectories, factoring in the ballistic drop of the 30 rounds over distance. The eastern window was clearly visible, a dark rectangle in the white-hot thermal image of the building. She could see the thermal signature of a fighter positioned there, firing down at the American positions in the courtyard. Titan, Revenant. I can take the shot, but you need to mark your positions and get your people away from the eastern wall right now. There was a pause that felt like an eternity but probably lasted only seconds. Then Hale's voice, tight with tension. Revenant Titan, marking with IR strobes now. All personnel are moving to the western side of the compound. You have 30 seconds before we breach the second floor. 30 seconds. Vance rolled the A-10 into a dive, steeper than before, the nose pointing almost straight down at the compound that grew larger in her windscreen with each passing heartbeat. The targeting pipper settled on the window. The range counter unwound. 1,500 feet. 1,000 feet. At 800 feet she fired, a short burst, exactly 1 second, the cannon roaring and the aircraft shuddering and the rounds leaving the gun in a cone that converged on a single point. She pulled out of the dive at 600 feet, the G-forces crushing her into the seat, the mountain peaks flashing past on either side as she climbed back to safety. The radio silence lasted 5 seconds that felt like 5 years. Then Staff Sergeant Hale's voice came through, and for the first time since the mission began, there was something approaching awe in his tone. Revenant Titan, that was unfucking believable. You put every single round through that window. The entire second floor is cleared. We're securing the compound now. How the hell did you do that? Captain Vance didn't answer immediately. She was breathing hard, the adrenaline finally catching up with her, her hands shaking slightly on the controls. She just performed a gun run that would have been considered dangerous in a training environment with no enemy fire and perfect conditions. She'd done it in combat, with lives on the line, with no room for error. She keyed the mic. Titan, Revenant, just flying the jet, happy to help. In the operations center, Captain Malcolm Reeves stood utterly still, his eyes fixed on the video feed that showed the compound with one wall of the second floor partially collapsed, the window now a ragged hole, smoke drifting from the interior. The precision was inhuman. The execution was flawless. The entire room had gone silent, every person present watching the feed, understanding that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Major Carlson let out a breath he'd been holding. Someone get her gun camera footage. I want a frame-by-frame analysis of that run. That was weapons school demonstration-level shooting in actual combat. Reeves finally moved, turning away from the screens and walking toward the exit of the operations center. He pushed through the heavy canvas flap into the afternoon heat and stood there, letting the sun hammer down on his face, processing what he'd just watched. He'd been flying combat missions for 3 years. He'd seen good pilots and great pilots and pilots who could thread the needle when it mattered. What he'd just watched was something different. That was mastery. That was the kind of flying that transcended technique and became art. He'd mocked her. He'd dismissed her before she'd even landed at the FOB. He'd assumed that because she'd come from a training command, because she'd never deployed before, because she didn't fit his preconceived notion of what a combat pilot looked like, that she wasn't capable of performing at the highest level. He'd been wrong. Completely, embarrassingly, professionally wrong. The canvas flap pushed open behind him and Major Carlson stepped out, squinting against the sun. He stood beside Reeves without speaking for a moment, then said quietly, "You going to apologize?" Reeves shook his head slowly. "No, I'm going to be better." The debriefing happened 3 hours after Captain Vance landed, after the A-10 had been refueled and rearmed, after Romeo Company had been extracted from the valley with 0 friendly casualties and 12 enemy fighters killed in action. The operations center was packed with personnel, far more than had been at the morning briefing, word having spread through the FOB like wildfire. Staff Sergeant Hale stood at the front of the room beside the tactical display, his uniform still dusty from the mountain, his face showing the exhaustion of a combat patrol that had lasted 12 hours. But his eyes were bright as he walked through the engagement sequence, pointing to positions on the map, describing the precision of the air support that had made the difference between mission success and potential catastrophe. Captain Vance sat in the same corner she'd occupied that morning, her flight suit still damp with sweat, her hair pulled back in the same regulation bun. She wasn't taking notes this time. She was just listening, her face neutral, as Hale described the gun runs in technical detail. The first engagement eliminated 3 fighting positions with approximately 15 enemy fighters, Hale explained, his finger tracing the ridgeline on the map. The accuracy was surgical. Every round on target, 0 collateral damage, friendly forces were within 100 meters. That's danger close, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of fire support that keeps infantry alive. He moved to the next sequence. The second engagement was even more impressive. 2 separate positions, 50 meters apart, engaged with a single gun run that walked the rounds between targets. I've never seen anything like it. The entire enemy force was neutralized in under 30 seconds. Major Carlson stood at the back of the room, watching Vance's face, seeing no pride, no satisfaction, just professional attention to the debrief. That told him something important. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because it was the job. Hale continued, his voice growing more animated. The third engagement, the compound assault. I'm not sure how to describe that except to say that Captain Vance put a burst of 30 through a specific window from 800 feet while we were in the building. I've never asked for fire support that precise, and I never will again because I don't think anyone else could pull it off. The room was silent. Hale turned to face Vance directly. Ma'am, on behalf of Romeo Company, thank you. You saved lives today. We're all going home because of your flying. Vance nodded once, a slight dip of her chin, acknowledging the thanks without making it into something bigger than it needed to be. Captain Malcolm Reeves waited until the debriefing ended and the crowd dispersed before approaching Captain Vance. She was standing by the coffee station, filling a styrofoam cup with liquid that had been sitting on the burner so long it resembled motor oil more than coffee. She didn't look up as he approached, but he could tell from the slight tension in her shoulders that she knew he was there. He stood beside her, poured his own cup of terrible coffee, and took a sip that burned all the way down. They stood there in silence for a moment, 2 pilots who had nothing and everything to say to each other. Finally, Reeves spoke. That was exceptional flying today. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. Vance took a sip of her coffee, still not looking at him. Just doing the job. The words were simple, but Reeves heard the message underneath them. She knew about the mockery, about the dismissive comments, about the reputation that had preceded her. She was too professional to call him out on it directly, but she was letting him know that she'd heard and that she'd proved him wrong on her own terms. Reeves felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the coffee. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you before you even got here. I was wrong. What you did today, that was world class. That was some of the best close air support I've ever seen, and I've been doing this for 3 years. Now Vance did look at him, her dark eyes meeting his without anger or judgment, just a level assessment of whether he meant what he was saying. After a moment she nodded. Apology accepted, but you should know that I didn't come here to prove anything to you or anyone else. I came here to do my job. The soldiers on the ground don't care about my flight hours or my background or where I came from. They care about whether I can put ordnance on target when they need it. That's the only thing that matters. Was right, and Reeves knew it. In combat, credentials were meaningless. Performance was everything. Results were the only currency that counted. He'd been focused on the wrong metrics, judging her based on a checklist that had nothing to do with her actual capability. How did you learn to shoot like that? The question came out before he could stop it, genuine curiosity overriding his embarrassment. For the first time, Vance's expression softened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. Practice. Thousands of hours in the simulator running every possible scenario. Weapons school where they taught me how to calculate angles in my head. But mostly it's just understanding the aircraft, knowing what it can do, trusting it to do what I need when I need it. The story of how Captain Kiera Vance earned the call sign Revenant began to spread through forward operating base Sentinel like smoke, told and retold with embellishments and exaggerations that transformed reality into legend. The pilots told it one way, emphasizing the technical difficulty of the gun runs, the precision required, the nerves of steel. The infantry told it differently, focusing on the moment when fire support appeared out of nowhere and turned the tide of a desperate engagement, on the way the A-10 had seemed to materialize exactly when needed most. The crew chiefs and maintainers had their own version, talking about the way Vance treated her aircraft, the hours she spent doing pre-flight inspections, the relationship between pilot and machine that went beyond technical proficiency into something approaching reverence. But the real story, the one that mattered, was known only to a few. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale knew it because he'd been the one to look up her service record after the mission, curious about the pilot who just saved his entire unit. He'd found the incident report from 3 years earlier, when Captain Vance had been a lieutenant fresh out of flight school, still learning to trust her own skills. She'd been flying a training mission over the Nevada desert when her engine had catastrophically failed at 8,000 feet. Standard procedure was to eject, to pull the handles and trust the parachute, and let the multi-million-dollar aircraft crater into the desert floor. But Vance hadn't ejected. She'd calculated the glide ratio, picked out a dry lake bed 6 miles away, and dead-sticked the A-10 onto the hard-packed surface at 140 knots with no power and no hydraulics, using only the manual backup flight controls. The aircraft had been repairable. She'd walked away without injury. The investigation board had ruled it pilot error for not ejecting immediately, had grounded her for 6 months, had nearly ended her career before it started. That incident had earned her the call sign Revenant, one who returns from the dead. It was meant as a joke at first, a reminder of her refusal to abandon the aircraft, but Vance had kept it because it meant something to her. It meant that she didn't quit. It meant that she found ways to survive impossible situations. It meant that when everyone expected her to fail, she found a way to succeed. Now, 3 years later, that same determination had manifested in the skis over Afghanistan, turning training and preparation and sheer stubborn will into combat effectiveness that bordered on the supernatural. The second week at Forward Operating Base Sentinel passed differently than the first. Captain Vance flew 4 more missions, each one requiring the kind of close air support that made staff officers nervous and infantry soldiers grateful. She destroyed a Taliban mortar position that had been hammering combat outpost Restrepo for 3 days. She guided an ambushed convoy through a valley using her targeting pod to identify escape routes invisible from ground level. She put a Maverick missile through the window of a compound where a high-value target was meeting with cell leaders, the explosion contained entirely within the structure, minimizing collateral damage in a densely populated area. Each mission added to the growing reputation, but Vance remained exactly as she'd been from the beginning: professional, focused, unapproachable except in the context of the mission. She didn't socialize in the dining facility. She didn't participate in the poker games that ran late into the night in the pilot quarters. She spent her off-duty hours studying intelligence reports, reviewing gun camera footage from her previous missions, memorizing terrain features and approach vectors for areas where she might be called to provide support. Captain Reeves found himself watching her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He'd apologized, she'd accepted, and they'd moved on to a working relationship that was professional if not warm. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something driving her, some internal motivation that went beyond simple duty or even patriotism. One evening, after a particularly long mission debriefing, he found her on the flight line again, walking the pre-flight inspection on her even though the crew chiefs had already turned it for the next day's operations. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and the heat was finally releasing its grip on the base. He approached carefully, not wanting to intrude but unable to resist the question that had been building in his mind for days. Why do you do the pre-flight yourself? The crew chiefs are good. They catch everything. Vance didn't pause in her inspection, running her hand along the leading edge of the wing, checking for damage, for stress fractures, for anything that might compromise the aircraft's integrity. Because it's my life depending on this machine working correctly. The crew chiefs are excellent, but nobody has more incentive than me to make sure everything's right. She moved to the next inspection point. Besides, it helps me think, helps me process the day. The question came late one night in the operations center when Captain Reeves and Captain Vance were both pulling staff duty, monitoring radio frequencies and tracking aircraft positions on the tactical display. The base was quiet, most personnel asleep, only essential operations continuing through the small hours. They sat at opposite ends of the room at first, each focused on their own tasks, the silence between them comfortable in the way it can be between people who have moved past the need for constant conversation. But around 0200 hours, Reeves stood and walked over to where Vance sat reviewing intelligence summaries for the next day's missions. He had 2 cups of coffee, both fresh from the pot he just brewed, and he offered her one without speaking. She took it with a nod of thanks. He pulled up a chair and sat, not directly beside her but at an angle that allowed conversation without forcing it. For several minutes, they just drank their coffee and watched the displays showing aircraft positions across Afghanistan, each glowing icon representing lives depending on fuel and ordnance and the skill of pilots who were somewhere out there in the darkness. Finally, Reeves spoke. "Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Vance looked at him, her expression neutral, waiting. "Why didn't you eject?" The question hung in the air between them. Reeves immediately wondered if he'd overstepped, if this was too personal, too close to something that shouldn't be examined in the harsh light of direct inquiry. But Vance's expression didn't change. She took another sip of coffee, set the cup down on the desk, and looked back at the tactical display. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Because I knew I could save it. I'd done the calculations 100 times in training, knew the glide ratio, knew what the aircraft could do. Everyone said I should have pulled the handles immediately, that I was reckless for trying to land it, but they weren't there. They weren't in the cockpit feeling the controls, understanding what the aircraft was telling me. I knew I could bring it down safely, and I did." She paused, then continued. "The investigation board disagreed. Said I'd violated procedure, that I'd unnecessarily risked a valuable asset, me, to save a replaceable aircraft. They grounded me for 6 months, sent me to training command where I couldn't do any more damage. But I'd do it again the same way because I was right and they were wrong." The reality of Captain Vance's situation became clear to Captain Reeves through fragments of conversation over the following weeks, pieces of a larger picture that he assembled slowly. She'd been sent to Afghanistan not as a reward or an opportunity, but as a last chance, a final proving ground before the Air Force made a decision about her career. The incident with the dead stick landing had followed her like a shadow, raising questions about her judgment, her decision-making, her willingness to follow procedures even when she disagreed with them. Training command had been a holding pattern, a place to park a pilot who was technically proficient but administratively problematic. She'd spent 3 years teaching other pilots how to employ the A-10, sharing her expertise while being denied the opportunity to use it in the environment where it mattered most. Then the deployment orders had come through, not to a cushy airbase in Qatar, but to a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. Some officers would have seen it as punishment. Vance had seen it as vindication. Major Carlson confirmed it one afternoon when Reeves asked directly about Vance's orders. They were standing in the operations center watching video feed from a mission in progress, and Carlson spoke quietly enough that no one else could hear. She's here because someone in the Pentagon wanted to see if she could perform in combat or if the incident from 3 years ago was indicative of a deeper judgment problem. This deployment is essentially her evaluation. She does well, the grounding incident gets forgotten and she continues her career. She screws up, or if she's just average, then she gets quietly reassigned to a desk job somewhere and eventually pushed out. Reeves felt anger rise in his chest, hot and sudden. That's bullshit. You've seen what she can do. She's the best CAS pilot we have on this FOB, possibly the best in theater. And they're treating this like some kind of test. Carlson shrugged, his expression tired. Welcome to the military, Reeves. Politics and procedures matter more than performance sometimes. But here's the thing, she knows the situation and she's using it. Every mission she flies, every gun run she makes, every time she puts ordnance exactly where it needs to be, she's building a case that can't be ignored. She's making herself indispensable. He was right. Vance wasn't just flying missions. She was constructing an argument, demonstrating value that transcended bureaucratic concerns about procedure and following orders. The request came through on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was at its peak, and most of the FOB was sheltering indoors from temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees. Captain Vance was in the operations center reviewing mission footage when Major Carlson walked in with a folder stamped with classification markings and an expression that suggested the news inside wasn't simple. He called her into the side office, a small space barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, and closed the door. Captain Reeves watched through the window, seeing Carlson open the folder and slide papers across the desk toward Vance. Her expression didn't change as she read, but Reeves noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. When Vance emerged, she walked directly to her gear locker without speaking to anyone, began pulling out her survival vest and checking equipment. Reeves followed her. What's going on? She didn't look up from her inspection of the vest, checking each pocket, each piece of equipment, the survival radio, the signal mirror, the combat knife. High-value target, time-sensitive. They want an A-10 on station for a raid that's happening tonight in the Tangi Valley. The Tangi Valley. Reeves felt his stomach tighten. The Tangi was where helicopters went to die, a narrow chasm of steep walls and unpredictable winds where the Taliban had learned to set ambushes that had claimed multiple aircraft. It was a place where pilots went only when absolutely necessary, and even then with maximum support and carefully planned escape routes. They're sending you alone. Vance finally looked up, and Reeves saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, not fear, but acknowledgement of the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. Special operations. They need someone who can provide close air support in a confined space with friendly forces potentially in contact. They specifically requested Revenant. Of course they had. Her reputation had spread beyond the FOB, carried by radio chatter and after-action reports, and the kind of word-of-mouth communication that travels faster than official channels. The special operations community knew who she was now, knew what she could do, and they wanted her skills for an operation that would be incredibly dangerous even with perfect execution. She continued checking her gear, moving with the methodical precision of someone who knew that attention to detail was the difference between life and death. Mission brief is at 1800 hours, wheels up at 2100, on station before midnight. The mission briefing was held in a secured section of the operations center, attendance restricted to essential personnel only. Captain Vance sat in the front row, her flight suit already on, her gear ready, her focus absolute. The briefing officer was a Navy SEAL lieutenant commander whose face was weathered beyond his years and whose eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much combat. He stood beside a detailed topographical map of the Tangi Valley that showed every ridge, every compound, every known enemy position. His voice was calm, professional, but underlying it was the tension of a mission where the odds of something going wrong were uncomfortably high. The target is Abdul Qadir, a Taliban commander responsible for multiple IED attacks and the ambush that killed 4 American soldiers last month. Intelligence indicates he's meeting tonight with cell leaders in a compound here. He pointed to a spot deep in the valley, surrounded by high walls of rock and accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through the canyon. A ground element will be inserting via helicopter at 23:30 hours. Expected time on target is less than 10 minutes. Your job, Captain Vance, is to provide overwatch and immediate fire support if needed. The challenge is the terrain. The valley is less than half a kilometer wide at some points. Walls rise to 4,000 feet. Winds are unpredictable. You'll be operating at night in confined space with friendly helicopters in the area. This is about as difficult as close air support gets. Vance studied the map, her eyes tracing the contours, calculating angles of attack, identifying potential problems. What's the threat assessment? The SEAL commander's expression grew darker. Heavy. The Taliban knows we use this valley and they've prepared accordingly. We've documented at least 5 heavy machine gun positions on the ridgelines, possible RPGs, and definitely small arms fire. They've ambushed 3 helicopters in this valley in the last year. This is their home terrain, and they know how to use it. Captain Reeves sat in the back of the room, watching Vance absorb this information without visible reaction. Any sane pilot would be calculating the risks right now, weighing the danger against the mission importance, considering whether the objective was worth the potential cost. But Vance just nodded, her focus already moving to the next question. Rules of engagement. The commander slid a paper across the table. Standard row with one critical caveat. The compound is in a populated area. Collateral damage must be minimized. If you have to employ weapons, it needs to be surgical. The night was absolute darkness. No moon, the stars hidden by a layer of high clouds that turned the sky into a black void. Captain Vance sat in the cockpit of her A-10, engines running, waiting for final clearance to taxi. The aircraft had been configured for night-close air support. Full load of 30 ammunition, 2 Maverick missiles, targeting pod calibrated, night vision equipment tested and functioning. She ran through her pre-flight checks one final time, her hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency, her mind already in the valley, visualizing the terrain, the angles, the approach vectors she'd memorized during the briefing. The radio crackled. Revenant Tower, you are cleared for taxi runway 27. Weather en route is clear, winds at altitude are 15 knots from the west. Good hunting. She released the brakes and the A-10 rolled forward, its twin engines producing a low rumble that echoed across the darkened flight line. As she taxied toward the runway, she passed the operations center where lights still burned.